Hey, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name's Christina Kent, and I'm a fine artist based out of San Francisco. And in this video, I wanted to do some exercises to study the work of one of my favorite painters, Robert Bechtle. Now, Robert Bechtle was a California painter. He mostly lived and painted in the Bay Area, and he did lots of very nostalgic feeling paintings of everyday scenes, in particular cars and streets, and lots of paintings of the streets of San Francisco. So as someone who lives in the city of San Francisco, I absolutely love his paintings. I look at them and I just feel such a sense of home. And I also am really struck by his interesting and beautiful composition choices. So in this video, we're going to be doing some simple notan exercises to study how Robert Bechtle composes his paintings. I'm going to be focusing on two paintings of his. The first is this bright sort of daytime street scene where we get a sense of the hills in San Francisco. So we have the street that's sloping upwards. And this second painting is a slightly darker view, still a street scene, but it has a slightly different feeling to it. So we're going to be focusing on both of these paintings for this exercise. And as we study these paintings, we're going to focus on their design, the arrangement of darks and lights in the painting. I've taken each painting and I've increased the contrast, and I've also converted it to black and white. So if you want to follow along for this exercise, I would recommend looking at these black and white versions of these paintings so that you can get a better sense of the darks and the lights. For this exercise, I'll be using my Stay Wet palette with black and white acrylic gouache paint. I'll also be using two flat brushes, a small one and a medium one, and my Moleskine Pocket sketchbook. I also have a rag and a jar of water for cleaning my brushes. And I'll be using a mechanical pencil as well. To start, let's first just sketch out the general aspect ratio of each of the images that we're going to be sketching. So I just put in two rectangles about the same size as the paintings that I'm going to be working from. And then the goal is to do a notan sketch where we break the painting into dark and light shapes. So I start going in with my pencil and just vaguely start to mark out where I'm seeing the major dark and light shapes in the image. And if you're following along with this exercise or you want to do it for one of your own images, I would recommend working with a time limit. Remember, this is an exercise, it's a sketch, it doesn't need to be perfect, and setting a time limit will help you focus on the big picture. So you can see here that I'm putting in things like the dark shape of the curb, the shape of the car, the shadow that it's casting, the window of the building, and that strong shadow being cast by the building. But I'm being very soft with my pencil marks here and just trying to generally get the vague shapes of where they are. I'm going to be going in with the paint later and I'll be cleaning things up and refining things more. But the pencil sketches are just to help you get a general idea. As I'm doing this, I'm squinting a lot, and the squinting really helps to blur a lot of the smaller details so that I can focus on what are the main major shapes that I'm seeing in the image. Especially with this pencil sketch right now, I just want to get out where those major shapes, like the diagonal of the street or the bright highlights of the car or the highlight on the curb. I just want to mark out where these are to help give me some anchors when I start painting. So now that I've marked out where the major shapes are, then I'm going to go in and add paint and start to really refine what are the shapes that I'm seeing in the image. So we're going to start with the first scene, which is pretty bright. It's a relatively high-key scene, so we have a lot of lighter colors and then a few beautiful dark shadows in the image. Now, I like to start out with some of the easiest shapes first, so I'm going in with that big dark shape that's being cast by these houses along the street, and that's what I'm focusing on first as I'm doing this notan study. Now, with notans, like I said, we're breaking the image down into just black and white. So we're kind of taking a very extreme stance here. And you'll notice that even though I have increased the contrast of this image, there are still a lot of grays in the image. So when you do this, you're going to have to make some decisions on how to treat those grays. Do you want to lump them into the white shapes, or do you want to include them in the dark shapes? And so here, I think it's really helpful to squint, because sometimes when you're squinting, that can help you figure out whether or not this gray is leaning more towards light or leaning more towards dark. For example, in front of this house, this big gray wall, and I wasn't quite sure if I should include that as a dark shape or a light shape, because it's definitely darker than the highlight on the car, but it's lighter than the shadows in the background. Ultimately, when I squinted, I felt like the contrast between the rectangle of the house and the shadows on the streets behind it was stronger. So I decided to include that in my lighter shapes. And at this point in the sketch, I started to put in some of the white. So I put in my dark shapes, but I noticed that the white was too similar to the white of my sketchbook, or the off-white color of the sketchbook. So I just painted a gray frame to go around my notan study to see those borders. So after putting in the darks, I'm now going in with the white paint, and I'm sort of just refining some of the shapes that I put in with the darks. If you put in your dark shapes really precisely, then you don't really need to go through this stage, but I kind of like to do my notans as a multi-stage process. I feel like by going back and forth between adding some dark and then adding some white and then going back to the dark again, then I can gradually refine my shapes and get them closer and closer to how I want them to be, rather than trying to get all the shapes perfect on the first try. So that's why I like to use both white and black paint for this exercise. And you'll notice in the background there's a lot of really small shapes. I try to simplify those, so I'm squinting a lot, and I'm using sort of larger brushes on purpose. Although the brushes that I'm using, they are fairly small, but I try to stick to larger brushes on purpose because I want this to just be a thumbnail sketch. I want to focus on the overall design and not get too much into the details. After going back and forth a bit with the white and dark paint, refining the shapes, I feel like I've captured the overall design and I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm ready to move on to the second image. I feel like this next image is a great contrast for the first one because this one is a much lower key image. There's a lot more of those beautiful darks in this image compared to the one above. So I like putting this one next to the first one because I think the two designs will contrast each other quite nicely. So as with the first image, I put a gray border around the edges to kind of rein in the composition. And then I go in with my dark paint and I start adding in where I'm seeing those darkest shadows. And as I'm doing these exercises, one thing that pops out to me a lot is the diagonals in these compositions. So the image above has the nice diagonals of the curb on the street and also the shadow being cast by the stop sign and also even the shadow of the car itself. And then the second image has some great diagonals created by the stripes on I guess it's the crosswalk stripes, and also that diagonal from the street. And I think it's interesting how these diagonals sort of give a sense of interest, a sense of tension to these images that are otherwise very quiet and peaceful. I like seeing how the design is able to create that feeling even in a very quiet scene. And I feel like this is one of the beautiful things about notans, is that we're able to abstract away from the subject matter of the image and focus instead on what are the main shapes that we're seeing in this image. What does the image feel like? What are these shapes? What emotions are these shapes stirring within us? Sometimes when there's a really beautifully rendered image of something recognizable, we focus on the thing and what it means. But at the same time, I think there's so much beautiful abstraction going on with the shapes in the design of this image. And so doing these notan studies allows us to focus on that as well. And one thing with this image that was also particularly challenging was that there's a gradient on the street. So in the foreground, the street is quite dark, but then as it moves towards the background, it becomes pretty light. And so with a notan, it's kind of hard. You can't really capture the subtlety of a gradient. So instead, I just set a point where I felt like I could make a cutoff where the street goes from dark to light. And I think that that's one of the fun challenges with notan studies, is that you're really forced to simplify and to make decisions. And here there's no right or wrong way to do it. Especially when we're dealing with midtones, when we're dealing with grays, that's where you can really decide, do I want to group this with the darks or do I want to group this with the lights? And your choices here will create a totally different image. And as you can see, I'm adding some of the smaller details, but I'm not putting in all of the details here. I'm trying to still keep it very simplified. And notans are also a great exercise in figuring out how to simplify shapes in an image. If you're someone who struggles with getting into the details too much and you sort of get lost in the details, I would recommend doing some of these really small notan studies to try to focus on what are the larger shapes that you're seeing. And with this one, I was going back and forth on whether or not I wanted to add the details of the stop text painted on the street, but ultimately I decided to throw it in and see how it would look. So I just suggested a little bit of what that text was, and I think it added a nice touch. So here's the result of my notan studies. I spent about 30 minutes on each, and I'm really happy with how the images translated into these black and white forms. And here you can see a side-by-side comparison of my sketch with the original painting, and I just love seeing this comparison where you have all of the details and all of the nuance in the original, and then you have just the beautiful abstraction of the notan. Anyway, that's all I have for today. I hope you found this helpful and that you enjoyed following along. If you did like this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe to my channel, or if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. And if you know someone who might like this video, be sure to share it with them. If you want to see some of my own paintings of San Francisco, you can check them out on my website, christinakentart.com. And as always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for supporting this channel and making these videos happen. If you like my art, if you like my videos, and you want to help me make more, check out my Patreon at the link. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.